We've got three guest panel speakers: Kelvin Rundle from Landcom, William Makdessi from InConsult, and Andrew Lawrence from De.Iterate. So first of all, I'd like to start off with an overview of everyone's organisation and roles. And Kelvin, we will start with you.
Hi, everyone. As Michelle said, my name is Kelvin Rundle, and I'm a cybersecurity consultant for Landcom. And for those of you that don't know, Landcom is the New South Wales state government land developer, and their function is to provide affordable and sustainable housing within the state of New South Wales. So Landcom's a very interesting organisation because it has enterprise opportunities and challenges, but internally the Landcom team is actually a very small team.
Thank you, Kelvin. Over to you, William.
Hi, everyone. My name is William Makdessi. I'm the cyber risk lead for InConsult. InConsult's been around for about 21 years. We provide all kinds of services like audit, risk management, business continuity, cybersecurity, third party, even climate risk. I primarily focus on cybersecurity framework audit, cyber gap analyses, and general advice to strengthen organizations' cyber risk posture.
Excellent, thank you. And Andrew.
Hi, everyone. It's good to be here. So I'm Andrew Lawrence, and I'm the founder of a company called De.Iterate. De.Iterate is fundamentally is a compliance platform that delivers information security compliance policy and training to small and growing businesses to get them compliant with standards like ISO 7001 and other programs, and sort of avoids the pitfalls that we typically see in this space around old legacy paper-based platforms. So that's De.Iterate.
Thank you so much for the intros. All right, well, look, just to start off with the first question with you, Andrew. With the rapid digital transformation happening across the globe, what, according to you, are two of the biggest challenges with an organization's cybersecurity as of now?
Two challenges. I guess the fact that it's hard to pick only two is probably one of the biggest challenges. But I think if I had to pick two sort of large buckets, one would be clarity and the other one would be comprehension. So clarity being, organizations that need to know these days, where do I need to look? What do I need to look at? How do I remove the noise from the data that's coming in? Because we do get a lot of data these days. And being able to find a consistent measurement and being able to use a consistent measuring tool to measure kind of what good looks like in the environment. And as for comprehension, I think, traditionally we've always talked about, users and user education, but what I think we really need to dive into is how many of our users really understand what we're talking about when we're in the security industry, and we use a lot of buzzwords and a lot of jargon, but being able to clearly communicate to our user base and getting them to understand what the practical side of security looks like at that company, so that way they can be along for that journey. They can help us, get better rather than being an unfortunate sort of target in that environment. That'd be the two.
Perfect, thank you. Look, I think that makes a lot of sense, especially when you're talking about users and helping them understand really sometimes very technical jargon. Yeah. Kelvin, the next question is for you. Being part of a government organisation, as Landcom is, do you think that security priorities differ in comparison to your past experience with other non-government organisations?
I think these days a lot of the priorities for government are similar, and particularly with a lot of organisations like Landcom being state government-owned corporations. So they're given a little bit more freedom to operate as companies or businesses, as opposed to, I guess, more of that traditional government structure. And then one of the things that government is finding, I think government is finding more and more, which is similar to business, is the number of suppliers which are involved as part of cyber risk supply chain. There's a lot of moving parts as part of that, particularly for organisations that are essentially service aggregators, as opposed to delivering the service themselves.
Yeah. Question for you, back to you, Andrew. On the question of your own organization's security. How do you think that security ratings help? And what could potentially be improved, such as the leading or lagging indicators?
Yeah, I think everyone, I guess, could look at their own security program and find things that could be improved. And it just depends on the organization's maturity level. I'm sure that we've seen people at both ends of that spectrum, and we've been at companies at both ends of that spectrum. But being able to have a consistent measurement, I'm going to come back to that again. But that is so critically important to be able to say this is what good looks like, and not just being able to measure attendance, which is kind of what we're used to measuring, but being able to actually measure quality, I think is something that we need to kind of graduate to. The lead and the lag indicators, I think we've all kind of tried for a long time to try and find sort of ubiquitous, consistent measurements for what is a leading indicator of security like, what is something that is showing us that we're going in the right direction, and how do we effectively communicate that, not just at company A, but across the board. And then in a similar fashion, what is an indicator that things might not be going in the right direction, and how do we raise a red flag at the right time and not do what unfortunately the InfoSec industry does quite well, is raise a red flag a lot of the time and become kind of that white noise in the background. So coming up with a decent leading indicator and a decent lagging indicator, and it's one of the reasons I like the UpGuard platform for this stuff too, is because it is a consistent measurement. I get my score. I get to be able to say this score is something I can point at, and I can point out to it today, and I can point at it over time, and I can build that into my program to say, when I see this, then I'll make these decisions. For that consistent measurement, I think I'll stop saying the word measurement, but yeah, consistent measurement.
Okay, perfect. And do you think that there's anything else that could be improved over and above what you've kind of already mentioned with measurements and being able to point to scores over time, for example? Is there anything else that you would say, let's improve this process?
Well, I think we're all looking after our own domain, right? So I look after the domain for my company or the companies that I'm associated with, but I don't have a good way of looking at, say, Williams' stack and being able to say what that looks like over there. So I think we've done well in the last few years to get collaboration working really well. Threat information sharing and stuff like that all happens these days. It's not as ubiquitous as we'd like it to be, but it's definitely getting there. Measuring those other pieces and what we look like as organizations, I think is something that we could do better at. But it is an improvement over time, right? I think there's, like we said from the first question about what we need to look at, there is so much to look at once. It is really a matter of prioritization, but I think we could definitely improve in those areas about collaboration and sharing across companies and industries.
Yeah, absolutely. William, for you, your use case of UpGuard and your cybersecurity in general is slightly different to most of our customers. Are you able to share a bit more about what you do within InConsult?
Yeah, sure. So we do actually have two use cases, really. We have your typical use of UpGuard to assist clients with things like preparation for ISO 27001 certification. So while we can't provide the certification itself, we can prep them and get them as close as possible to a pass, so they know that they're going to pass when they try. Things like that, and APRA CPS 234, NIST cybersecurity framework, etc. But then again, we also have our own infrastructure assessments that we do, gap analyses, and one of the most different ones that we use cases that we have that we don't really know a lot of people that use UpGuard use it for is performing vendor risk assessments for our clients as opposed to ourselves. So we do assess our own vendors, but we provide a product where we use UpGuard to essentially take over and managing the communication, the questionnaires, outputting a customized, I suppose what you could call a translated executive report. Now, the reason I'll probably call it translated is instead of just providing remediation to issues or findings, or maybe as Kelvin said, observations, which is probably a better word, we sometimes get involved with the vendors. We provide the support to fix the issue, or at least steer them in the right direction. Because we provide a lot of services, most of the time we can provide a fix for it, or we can provide assistance in developing what's missing. Like in a lot of cases, they're missing a cybersecurity policy, or their framework just isn't there. even for more basic technical issues like DMARC policies, ports being left open. Our last client that had a pretty poor score, vendor, which was a vendor of a client, we actually went that far and actually helped that client close the ports on their website to fix their score. So we do provide assistance beyond just the typical UpGuard report, and we do provide our own bespoke executive report that covers quite a bit more than just what UpGuard gives as a response, but it's a fantastic base to make our report off of.
Okay, very interesting. And are you able to talk a bit more about information asset management and what you do there?
Yeah, so I mentioned earlier APRA CPS 234, which is the Information Security Prudential Standard, which is required by a lot of financial institutions in Australia. They've brought in a heavy dependence on information asset management, which is rightly so. It's part of the NIST cybersecurity framework, and everyone should be doing it. Essentially, with our third, fourth, even fifth party dependence, that's so common these days with our dependence on providers and vendors that provide IT services, for example. We really need to understand where the data is, who's managing it, where it's being hosted, and particularly the security and recovery controls that are being used to protect it. That's something that a lot of people don't know. Just because Microsoft Azure, for example, has a bridging letter for SOC reports, that might not be enough for some of your partners. They might want you to actually go and do an independent assessment or get more information about how the assets are being managed. So it's good to at least know where your data is sitting, what kind of regulations it actually falls under as well, because it could be living in a different country. It might fall under different laws as well. So there's different data management laws and all that kind of stuff. So we've actually created our own custom questionnaire in UpGuard that addresses APRA CPS 234's requirements around information asset management, but also a broad variety of different categories that these different frameworks have. And we've tried to generalize it so that it can be applied to any sector. So I can actually send this questionnaire to someone in the financial industry, but then I can also go and send it to someone in IT, then someone in the commercial industry who does construction. It should apply to all, and they should be able to confidently answer any of those questions.
Oh, awesome. Thanks for sharing that. All right, Andrew, back to you for the next question. The question is, what are some of the legacy challenges with vendor risk management? And how do you think solutions in the vendor risk management space are solving them? And you're on mute.
I swore I'd get away with one meeting this year without doing that. Yeah. I think the legacy problems with vendor management are still the problems we have today. I don't think I could accurately call them legacy problems, except for the fact that they've been around for a while. So I think, talking sort of graduating from what we were talking about before, really is, we've gone from measuring attendance, right, which is what we've been used to doing, and we started off with the paper-based, assessments, and nobody likes those, right? And we've graduated to doing digital assessments, which is great, and we're getting a little bit of that quality sort of measurement in there at the moment, which is awesome. But I think still those legacy problems exist, where not everybody, will submit to a digital assessment, or not everybody wants to use a platform to do that. So some of those problems still exist. I think, the flip side, and we were talking a little bit before the call about this, is, companies that may not be mature in that space, that are kind of a little bit apprehensive about doing a digital assessment, they can actually really benefit from doing that, and being handed from a mature company a clear list of deliverables, or a clear list of action items for them to improve their posture is kind of like a free professional services engagement for a small company, right? So I think those legacy problems, a little bit of fear, and a little bit of the unknown, still creep through. But I think as we go through and do more and more of these assessments, and we speak to more and more companies, they're getting a bit more comfortable with it, which is really nice. And you're able to see the benefit flow through. And some of those companies who may not have dedicated security teams, or teams, or outsourced teams that can do security for them, are getting a little bit of that benefit from those bigger companies, which I think is a really nice offshoot of having these sort of bigger companies looking after the smaller ones too.
Yeah, fair enough. And look, I guess a sort of a follow-up question. to that, I guess, would be, in your experience and maybe other peers around you in the industry, what do you find when, when you send out this kind of information to vendors? Do you get positive feedback, negative feedback? And I might actually put this question out to everyone here in the panel today. But what's the typical kind of feedback that you get from vendors when you do give them this, essentially free advice or information about their posture?
I'll go first. I'm sure everyone has their own history there, but I guess it's a bit of a mixed bag. You get some people who are very much against it, and they don't really want to go through the process. You get those people who are willing to take it by the horns and say, please help me and tell me what I'm doing that you think I should change, because I don't know myself, which is really nice. And then you get some of those people who take it as a real challenge to say, well, I want to get an A. I want to make sure I got the highest score possible. What did I get wrong? And they're the high performers. I'd put them in the high performing category. But it's always nice to get a high performer, because you don't have to worry as much about them as you do some of the others.
Yeah, for sure. Maybe William,
I'll
what's your
jump
thoughts
in.
on
Yeah,
that?
I've got a
Yeah.
couple of different opinions on it. I think it's relevant to the score, kind of like Andrew was saying. With your really low performers, something that Kelvin was talking about earlier before we jumped in here was you sometimes from the IT side you'll get denial, and then from the risk or business side you get a lot of fear, which is what you'll see in a low score, because they're obviously thinking about, how am I going to explain this to the executive team, or if I'm the vendor of the client you're assessing us for, how am I going to explain this to the client? They're not going to use us anymore. So there's a lot of back and forth with them and assisting them and saying, okay, look, we'll help you out here, give you advice on this. This is what you need to do, and this will dramatically increase your score. Blah blah blah. But yeah, it really does depend on their score. Overall, you can actually tell who's experienced in this as well. Been doing this for quite a few years with you guys, as you know. We've been a customer of yours for quite some time. So those who have been constant recipients of our questionnaires, even from different clients, they just kill it. They know what's coming. They know how to do well on the scores. They respond really quickly. And then there's the ones who you haven't dealt with before. Unless you build up a rapport with them first through the client, you've built that bridge, you're going to have a lot of trouble getting in touch with them at first, getting them to complete the questionnaire. Sometimes they'll drag it out for months, and unfortunately it does happen, but you just got to try to deal with it as best you can.
Yeah. And for yourself, Kelvin, what are your experiences there?
So I think it's probably about 50-50 in terms of positive and negative. And I think there is a lot of the assessment can be quite confrontational. And so like some of the things that we've found is not calling it an assessment is a really good starting point. So as William said before, we try to make observations as opposed to findings. And we talk about UpGuard as being symptomatic. So we give people the benefit of the doubt rather than saying UpGuard is right. If someone questions a particular aspect, then it's important that you take the time to go through and explain why perhaps that score was not as high as they were expecting or wanting. And then we find as well, by focusing on the recommendations and making them time-bound, and also prioritising them, because it can be quite overwhelming, particularly if an organisation's score is quite low, which is really common, especially for startups, because like startups are building capability first, and then they're typically doing security second. Quite often the sales team is ahead perhaps of the tech team as well. So like that kind of left unchecked, that can become quite confrontational. And I think it's just a matter of, like, one of the things that we do every single time is we have a call. We don't send the report straight through. We don't even let people know what their score is. We actually ask for a call, and we just spend 30 minutes talking about the observations. So what are some observations that go well, and then what are the top things to work on, and what are some realistic timeframes? Because like Andrew was saying, it can be quite overwhelming if you give someone 100 recommendations to get their score up. So it's just a matter of picking a couple and then watching that success. But it is really interesting to see the number of high achievers, of organisations that start perhaps with a really low score and are determined to kind of get the best score in UpGuard ever.
Yeah, yeah. And to that point as well, Kelvin, something we talked about just before we jumped on live actually was what you do within your organization to encourage vendors to go from often a very, very low score to often a very high score. Are you able to talk a little bit more about that as well?
I think the thing about UpGuard that I always explain to organisations is essentially your UpGuard score is public. It's available to anyone with access to UpGuard, which is a lot of organisations, whereas a penetration test is private. So it's pretty easy to kind of sweep a penetration test under the carpet and say, oh, we didn't go so well in that, let's never talk about it again. But whereas I explain with an UpGuard score, because it's symptomatic and because it's non-intrusive, and because it's always gathering information and then attributing that information to an organisation, it's not controllable. So you can't essentially manipulate an UpGuard score, particularly based on UpGuard scanning. The questionnaire, of course, you could manipulate that if you really wanted to, but you're going to get a difference between the questionnaire where you might say that you're amazing and then the UpGuard score that says perhaps not. And that's generally a really good discussion point. But we actually report back and track supply chain score and supply chain risk as part of the board report. And the board is they can relate to the A through to D side of things. And because it enables you to have a comparison between organisations, a comparison of your peers, because everyone loves a bit of competition. So to be able to go back and say, okay, against our peers, we're an A, of course, but most of our peers are, say, a B or a C. Like, that's a good thing. And then to be able to explain why that's the case is also a good thing. And then if you've had a drop in score, for example, you can explain that kind of thing. Likewise, if you've had an increase in score, it's really good to say, you know how we asked for some time or some money to go and work on this particular thing? Well, you can now see the result of that. And it's the same when we look at our supply chain, it's the same in being able, there's nothing better than being able to report back that a vendor that when you first started working with them might have been a D and is now an A. And that's because we've been working with them. And I think that helps the whole broader industry, not like it doesn't just help us, it helps kind of everyone. So, you know, all boats float on a rising tide. So if we can help our colleagues and if we can help our suppliers, then it's good for us, it's good for them, but it's also good for everyone else as well.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, look, that I think is a great response. Thank you. And I think also to sort of touch on that a little bit further, Andrew, from your perspective, and something we were talking about as well earlier on, just before we kicked off, was the measurement of hygiene, and you know how you've got assessments that give you that measurement. Are you able to talk a bit more about that side of you know, your thoughts there?
Yeah, we were talking about kind of some of the benefits of an arm's length assessment and benefits versus caveats, I guess. And I was saying before the call that I was a bit of a skeptic in the beginning about arm's length assessments because they are just that, right? They don't have context of the internal landscape of an organization. But I guess when you look at it in its totality, a good arm's length assessment, like an UpGuard assessment, giving you a score is a real hygiene score for your entire organization. And we find that when businesses have a decent score externally, as sort of Kelvin was alluding to before, it is a good indicator for good hygiene across the organization. There might be an argument early in the day, maybe during one of those early phases of denial, that that's just a public website. It doesn't matter if it's not doing controls A, B, or C. Whereas that's kind of counterintuitive, really, because how can anybody trust that you're doing those sort of things internally if you're not willing to do them externally? Talking about having a really, really secure enclave protecting the crown jewels of the company inside the borders is a really good story. And to Kelvin's point, that's the pen test, right? That's the internal report. Being able to show a quality external report and that you have taken the time to harden everything that's out there, that is your footprint, which is that digital footprint for all companies is a different size. But being able to say that you measure that footprint, you monitor that footprint, and you can accurately score that footprint like amongst your peers as well, which is fantastic. That is that's a good measurement, and it's a sales tool at the end of the day. Everyone wants to know that the company they're dealing with or they're about to do business with takes this as or more seriously than they do. No one wants to see that they're going to get a cowboy vendor come in and have to start sharing data with them, because these days that's just not acceptable. So I think those sort of arm's length assessments, I'm definitely a convert, are definitely worthy and help sort of everybody get a better picture earlier in the process and improve vendor monitoring and management. Which is again that measurement after the fact. Once you finish the onboarding process, being able to measure a vendor on over time is super important, and that's that graduation from attendance to quality I talked about before, where if you go into that vendor risk portal, you can see your vendor's score over a period of time. The first dashboard I think you see when you plug in a vendor is their score over the last 12 months. So you can see historically whether or not this vendor has been performing well or not. And in either case, it tells a good story, right? Maybe it's one of those vendors that were a D that became an A, and they get to proudly say we're an A now because we took it seriously. Or you might see that they were an A and that they're now a D, and you need to ask them a question about what's maybe changed in your environment to warrant this change in score. In which case, you're at a quality conversation already, and you're not stuck at this conversation about do you patch your servers? Or do you have firewall rules? My favorite questionnaire from the old paper-based questionnaires was are your data centers walls of solid construction? And the mind boggles at the incident that had to happen to generate the question, right? what had to happen back in the day to generate that question in a questionnaire?
Yeah.
I probably don't want to know. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's a lot of really valuable information. So appreciate that feedback. William, I think from your perspective as well, it'd be great to understand a little bit more about when you're working with vendors. What does that process of collecting information look like, and what are the challenges and best practices that you found to overcome that?
Yeah, so it's pretty much what I was talking about before, where I was saying you need to build a bridge or build some rapport with that vendor first. So because of our different use case where we get in touch with the client, they provide us their list of vendors, and then we take over from there. We still require the client to get a little bit involved in the beginning just to build up that bridge and that rapport with them, because an unwarranted email from someone saying, hey, we're doing a vendor assessment on this company, give us all your information in this questionnaire. Like, no one's going to believe that. They're just going to think you're an attacker or a threat actor. So you need to build that rapport first. That's really important in our use case. And when we started off really early, when we first started using UpGuard, we probably weren't the best at that. And that's why we realized that was an issue. We had vendors not replying, and then a couple would come back weeks later saying, oh, I thought this was spam. So that's a big reason we need to be careful with that. But yeah, look, once we get the information. I suppose the only other hurdle, and I'm sure everyone experiences this, is pushing some vendors to respond. I know some of them are busy. They take long to complete a questionnaire. You might give them a deadline and they'll still blow past the deadline. You just got to try use whatever good communication channels you've got. Maybe there's someone who is close to that account, or someone you know who is in good contact with that person, to be able to just give them that little nudge. It does happen, unfortunately. We're still yet to have a vendor assessment where there isn't at least one vendor that doesn't complete it on time. It just happens. I don't know if you'll ever be able to control that, but I will say, given the landscape is changing and everyone's getting used to the fact that assessments are happening more often, it is probably happening a little bit less. The last vendor assessment I did this year, there was definitely less. I had almost everyone reply on time except for one individual. So that was really good, promising, and hopefully in future it maintains that or gets better.
Yeah, look, that's really valuable information. I think that that's a challenge that no matter what kind of organization you are, whether you're small, medium, or enterprise level, you're going to have that challenge of having vendors that aren't responding to you, whether it's your outreach, your questionnaires, or any other feedback that you're trying to get from them as part of your assessment. And I think that that's a challenge that everyone's facing. So it's great to hear from you that you actually see that landscape changing and that vendors are
Yeah.
starting to realize it's important.
Probably the most common area we see it is a very small IT vendor providing IT services and then sending them like a 200 question
Yeah.
ISO 27001 questionnaire. It's just so overwhelming for them. And the fact
Yeah.
is, as the person doing the assessment, you need to know that a lot of this is probably not going to apply to them given the services they provide as well. So it's kind of about holding their hand, walking them through it and saying, look, I know probably 1/4, maybe even a third of this questionnaire does not even apply to you guys, but just touch base with me. Let me know if you have questions, just walk them through it. You just have to do that sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely. And Andrew and Kelvin, do you find that same challenge as well when it comes to, getting that vendor completion of questionnaires? And I think also a following point as well would be for each of you, do you find that you sometimes have to change the type of questionnaire that you might send to a vendor? So William, you mentioned, if it's a small vendor, do you really need to send that ISO questionnaire? Is that sort of something that is imperative within your organizations, or do you have strategies to sort of alleviate that difficulty with getting those vendor responses? Kelvin, looks like you've got
one of
a
the
comment.
first things I did actually with questionnaires is I created the questionnaire that I thought everyone in the business wanted, and then I sent it to the business to fill in. And then really quickly, everyone realized that actually sending someone a 250 question ISO 27001 questionnaire wasn't like what they wanted. We actually managed to get that down basically to 2 questions. One, a ISO 27001 compliant. If yes, please attach your last report. Or if no, then we would know to ask some additional questionnaires around some of the key 27001 controls. So working from that perspective, I think our questionnaire is about 24 questions in total. So we really went through and scrubbed it kind of as hard as we could. So because some organisations now, the questionnaire is so prevalent that some organisations actually employ teams of people just to ask questionnaires. But as William was saying, small organisations, particularly startups, it's generally like the chief technology officer, or it's the salesperson, or it's someone whose day job isn't filling in questionnaires, and their immediate response must be, oh gosh, not another questionnaire. Like, won't these people please leave me alone? So some of the other things, like some of the other tricks, apart from like in the kickoff call, is we've actually found if we know the answers to the questionnaire because we've done an RFP, then we can pre-populate it by sending the questionnaire to ourselves. And then any answers that we don't know, we can either get on the phone with them and just ask them, or 2, we can then resend that questionnaire but change the recipient to them. And in that case, they get all of the pre-populated answers from the last questionnaire which we've already filled in for them. So I think that it's about really being mindful of other people's time. So you want it, and this whole thing of working together, as I said before. So, you know, the objective here isn't just about us. It's not just about protecting Landcom, but it's about improving the whole ecosystem for everyone. So for them, for us, and for everyone around us. So taking more of that collaborative approach, as opposed to perhaps the more traditional kind of cynical security approach of you will fill in my questionnaire, seems to be quite effective. And our completion rates are now really, really high. The other thing we do as well is we actually open a ticket in our service desk system. And then we assign it an SLA so that we've got the secondary, so we don't actually have to look at UpGuard or monitor UpGuard to make sure that the questionnaire has been returned. If it hasn't been returned within the SLA time, then the ticket auto escalates. And then at that stage, we know we can reach out and we can actually say, can we just, what's the roadblock? Can we get it done?
Awesome answer. And so I guess that kind of ties into something else that we talked about a week or so ago, which is, you know, the fact that you are a very small team, and you mentioned you sort of feel like you're working in an enterprise level company with a very small team, and is that sort of how you manage all your thousands of vendors? No.
Yeah, and I think you've got to really focus on what information you need and what you need right now. So not all 1,000 suppliers in the supply chain need a questionnaire. So depending on what service they're providing, you might just be happy with their overall UpGuard score. And it takes next to no time at all. Like when we put UpGuard in, one of the first things I did is I just went to the intranet and got the list of approved suppliers and then just added all of their domains to UpGuard. And then from there, you can really quickly identify working back with the business. Was there anyone that we should send a questionnaire to out of that because we were concerned about their score, or we were concerned about their score and their function? So Landcom, as I said, is a really small team, but that's actually really great because what we've been able to do is integrate UpGuard across the business. So rather than having the UpGuard person whose job it is to send out questionnaires all day, every day, and look at UpGuard like every single day, is we've incorporated the UpGuard functions into people's daily roles. So as part of daily checks, for example, the UpGuard scores get checked for any significant movers either up or down. And then when people are compiling the monthly report, then the UpGuard scores go into that monthly report. So I think this is one of the really nice things about UpGuard is it's a real efficiency tool, and you don't have to get someone in just to manage UpGuard. But I think as well, like William's approach with InConsult's a really good approach as well, because where you can get bogged down from a time perspective is in that remediation. So where you have as part of the supply chain someone that has some room for improvement, I think that's where it would be really handy, rather than trying to do it yourself, is if you had a partner that you could work with and you could basically leave it to them without doing it like all day, every day, to help actually resolve some of those issues.
Awesome feedback, thank you. And Andrew, did you have anything to add to that as well?
No, it's just interesting to hear the different use cases about how it happens, and I think kind of echoing some of the things that Kelvin said in previous roles, and it differs company to company when we do engagements. Some want to take the heavy road, some want to take the light road, but our ideal sort of middle ground for most people is to do a quick rec on what data are you sharing with these guys, and let that be an indicator for how hard you need to go in the next step. Like you said, and Kelvin, I envy your ability to go to intranet and find a list of vendors for a company. That That's rainbows and unicorns territory, right?
That's the benefit of government right there, Andrew.
I'm in the start.
Only use approved suppliers.
But yeah, being able to sort of take that measurement approach and to say, well, okay, if you're above score X, and we've always used sort of 700 as a bit of a median benchmark, to say if you're above 700 and you're only sharing data types A and B with a limited set of users, then you might just be okay with that public score. But as soon as you go above that and you use those other metrics of how many users are involved and how much data is being shared, then you might graduate to a bigger questionnaire. The piece that I like about being able to send a custom questionnaire is really about, you get to ask the questions you want to ask to get the answers you need to make a decision, rather than just asking those questions like, do you have a patching process, or do you run AV on your desktops? You can ask a question that gives you a better answer or a more in-depth answer, which could kind of answer 3 or 4 questions that you might have traditionally asked. So being able to help guide them along in that sense and ask more leading questions, then I think that sort of really helps. And getting it down to under 30 is a great spot, absolute great spot.
Yeah, so I should have mentioned one of the first questions we ask is basically, are we going to your place or are you coming to ours? Because the questions that you ask, if we're going to your place, then I'm going to care about a lot more things, and how you do your patching is probably one of them. But if you're coming to our place, i.e., you're providing a service within our environment, and it's in our control, then I don't really need to know as much about you. Versus if I'm handing over all of the financials and all of the customer data, then I want to make sure that that's protected.
Awesome. Yeah, look, we've actually had a couple of customer questions come through as well. So we'll actually ask those on behalf of, sorry, not customer questions, I should say attendance questions from the audience. So we'll actually ask those questions. But before I do, anyone who is listening, I do encourage you to pop through some questions as well. And we've got time. We've got a bit more time, so we will answer as many questions as we possibly can as they come through. So the first one comes from anonymous, unfortunately. But hi, Kelvin. Instead of calling your assessments, what do you normally call them instead to make them less confrontational?
We don't really call them anything. We just get on a call and say, we've looked at your organisation and we've got some observations and we've got some recommendations. Yeah, so just trying to stay away from anything like anything which could be construed as a negative or potentially embarrass someone. Just trying to stay away from that language. And as I said, just talking about observations and recommendations, and talking about UpGuard as being a symptoms checker, as opposed to risks or findings or those sorts of things. Then as you kind of get into that call a little bit further, you might talk about prioritization based on risk.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Yeah, look, I think that's a great way of sort of phrasing it. You've got that really sort of more gentle observational sort of, observation is one of the key words you use, but that observational language that makes it more of a conversation rather than a sort of almost a, not quite aggressive, but something close to aggressive approach to the vendors that might not have been expecting this before. The next question is from Jonathan. William, with your custom questionnaire that is suitable for a broad range of vendors in different industries, how do you manage to keep questions industry specific?
So we do base it on existing frameworks or prudential regulations. We don't necessarily just pull up random questions that we think are appropriate. So most commonly in this cybersecurity framework, Essential 8, APRA CPS 234, the ISO 31000 business continuity requirements. It's a combination of quite a few different standards and frameworks. That being said, we've got a team who work at InConsult who have well over 30 years of experience in risk and audit and disaster recovery. One of our directors works at SES as well in New South Wales. So we know all about all kinds of disasters and potential risks that could occur in many different ways. So we take that experience, combine it with all those frameworks, put it all together, and we actually have a cyber risk questionnaire, much like Kelvin's. I think it's only like, it's not like 20, 25 questions. I think it's more like 40 questions, but compared to like an ISO 27001 question, which is, look, if you hit all the wrong answers, I think it goes up to like 217 questions. It's a lot less than that. So to cover all of those as best you can, cram it into 40 questions, they really appreciate that, just like Kelvin said. So we try to keep it specific. If the frameworks change, so for example, the fraud and corruption framework 8001, I think it was, just got recently updated, and it has a heavy reliance on ISO 27001 compliance. So things like that, as soon as a new framework comes in, we know no one's really going to meet that standard very well for at least a couple of years, and there might not even be an audit or review by state government for at least a couple of years, because there is quite a lot of work involved. But we'll make the changes slowly over time. We'll integrate it into the questionnaire where we think it's appropriate, so that we just keep it up to date with the standards. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much. All right. Well, look, we're just, I think, about to wrap up. I think that's what we've got time for today. So, panelists, before we do wrap up for today's session, did you have anything else that you wanted to add, or any other feedback or information that you think is prudent to today's discussions that we've had?
No, it's been fun. Thanks, Michelle. Appreciate your time.
Thank you. Awesome. All right. Well, look, thank you so much for joining today. I really do appreciate your time, Andrew, Kelvin, and William. Thank you. And thank you to everyone who has joined us today to listen to Summit event, and also to listen to our guest speakers. And I really hope that everyone's got a lot out of it. I know I certainly have. So thank you so much. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.